Our second talk comes from Professor Du Tao from Tsinghua University. His talk title is Computational Design of Physical Systems with Solid-Fluid Coupling. Du Tao is an assistant professor at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Information Sciences at Tsinghua University. His research combines physics simulation, numerical analysis, and machine learning to understand physical systems. His research works have been published at top-tier graphics, learning, and robotics conferences and have been covered by major technology media outlets. Before joining Tsinghua, Du Tao obtained his master's degree in computer science at Stanford University and completed his PhD degree in computer science at MIT. Let's welcome his talk.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm glad to be here today to share our recent research works on computational design of physical systems with solid-fluid coupling. So let me motivate the talk by explaining why I feel excited about solid-fluid coupling using an example from nature. So this is known as a maple seed in biology. On the left, what you see is a very interesting and delicate structure. So, so there's a bulky and a heavy maple seed part on one end, and it is embedded in a very, very lightweight, very thin yet very large surface structure, which is essentially the leaf part. And this interesting structure, when this will lead to some very intricate but exciting aerodynamic effects when the maple seed starts to fall down to the ground in the air. And on the right, you see what you see is an overlay of 30 or 35 frames of the same maple seed falling down to the ground. And as you can see, due to some very interesting, possibly non-intuitive aerodynamic effects and the structure of the maple seed, it exhibits it basically swirls along a helical trajectory, leading to a very graceful landfall onto the ground. And in fact, this has inspired scientists and mechanical engineers to come up with an interesting aerial vehicle design known as a monocopter. A monocopter, it has only one propeller and one large wing. And it is a very asymmetrical design, but it flies, and it flies reasonably well. So let's take a look. As you can see, the monocopter exhibits its flight trajectory and flying behavior by self-spinning itself. And this essentially makes the wing like a gigantic blade, one half of a propeller, and it generates a very impressive thrust to weight ratio, because the propeller, the motor at this point only needs to provide sufficient thrust so that the self-spinning can be established. So this hopefully helps me convince you that studying solid-fluid interaction is an interesting and exciting topic, because you not only now know a little bit more about nature, and we also can draw inspirations from these from our deeper understanding of these mechanisms, and foster our designs on mechanical structures that can establish extreme or better performance than usual designs. So in today's talk, I'm going to briefly talk about three aspects of the computational design problem involving solid-fluid mechanics and solid-fluid structure. And the three aspects I chose are modeling, simulation, and optimization. And I'm going to use some of our recent works in each of the category to share our findings during this endeavor of computational design. So I will begin with a story about modeling, which turns out to be a crucial stage when we try to establish a design representation for solid-fluid structure. The paper I chose here was from it was in collaboration with my former colleagues at MIT. in this work, we attempted to design a microfluidic device, which is you can think of this as as something with a rigid surface boundary and interacts with the fluidic flow, so that you can manipulate the flow to establish certain performance metrics, like you want the flow to be faster, smaller, or you want to make it you want to let it make a turn. And I'm not going to reveal all the technical details behind the scene. Instead, I'm going to focus more on the major technical bottleneck or difficulty in this work, which turns out to be in the modeling part, and share the insights and interesting findings we found throughout this process. So here is basically a big picture of the problem we are tackling, designing the microfluidic device. And it begins with taking 2D as an example. It begins with a two-dimensional domain showing on the very left at the beginning of this pipeline. And this domain is divided up into lots of small cells or voxels. And if you are familiar with topology optimization, you might recognize this pattern, as we are basically doing very similar things here. So basically, in order to represent a device, a microfluidic device inside this domain, we're going to assign a decision variable into each of the voxel. Specifically speaking, we're going to basically decide whether we want this voxel to be the solid part or the fluid part, or we want this to be a solid fluid interface. And this constitutes a possible design involving solid, fluid, and their interaction. And our goal is to come up with a computational method so that we can optimize these designs by manipulating the parameters inside each of the voxels, so that a legitimate design can emerge, like what we show in the middle. Essentially, we can extract the boundary, reconstruct the actual geometry of this device, and make it work with fluid in forward simulation. So the trickiest thing here turns out to be we would like to have a uniform representation of the materials inside every single voxel, which varies between like purely solid, purely fluid, or lying along the solid fluid interface, or which has to respect the boundary conditions. And this turns out to be not very straightforward. And let me explain why this is a technical challenge in our work. The reason is that all sorts of possible materials we will encounter in this problem will exhibit different behaviors. And our core intuition here is that we would like to find a interpretable geometrical representation of the materials inside each of the voxel. And the idea comes from anisotropic materials in deformable solid. And we're going to use in 2D, we're going to use an oval shape to represent, to indicate their different behavior. So let me go through this more carefully with concrete examples. So let's first assume we have a material point inside the fluidic region. So on the lower right of the slide, we demonstrate a horizontal pipe where the boundary is labeled with black lines. And in the middle, there is flow. Basically, you can think of this as water flowing from left to right, and the blue arrow indicates the velocity of the flow. And if we are considering a particular point inside the fluidic region, we're going to encode its material with a large circle. And here, the dimension of the circle has its intuitive interpretation. It indicates the permeability of the material along any particular direction. Basically, it means how much do I want the flow to pass through me. So larger permeability means that it will be basically more fluidic because I allow water to go through this area. And for fluids, it has to be a big circle because along all directions, there's no reason to inhibit any flow. And Let's consider another simple case where we take into account a material point from a pure solid region. And in this case, the material can be well encoded or represented by a small sphere because it's solid region. So there's supposed to be zero velocity of the flow at this point. So a small sphere seems to be appropriate, meaning that along all directions, I don't want to see any flow. And similarly, if we consider what we are currently drawing here at the boundary indicated by the orange line, the boundary we are implementing here is called the no-slip boundary, meaning that if the water starts to get closer to the boundary, it will be heavily damped to zero velocity. So in some sense, this can be seen as part of the solid area because solid area also encourages the fluidic velocity to be zero. So we can inherit the representation from the solid material point and using just a small circle. What makes everything trickier on top of that is that if we take into account another type of boundary condition known as the free slip boundary condition, then we realized that there has to be some anisotropicity. So free slip boundary basically means that along the solid fluid interface, there's no friction at all that damps the velocity along the tangent direction. Therefore, if the flow is closer to the boundary, it should have as much like the tangent component of the velocity should be as large as it needs to be. On the other hand, along the normal direction on the boundary, the velocity has to be zero because it has to be inconsistent with the static boundary condition. So that means for points near the interface, in particular the free slip interface, we see two different material behaviors along the direction, two directions orthogonal to each other. The normal direction behaves like zero velocity, but the tangent direction or the tangent plane in 3D will behave like as if it is inside the fluidic area. Therefore, we figured that a single sphere is not sufficient in this case, and we will have to encode the material behavior with an eccentric ellipsoid, which means along one direction, we let the flow pass, but along the normal direction, we inhibit the flow. So this is the core idea behind modeling different various material behaviors in a unified way. And building on top of that, we are able to run standard topology optimization algorithms and come up with some interesting designs. So let me show one of the 5 or 6 examples from this paper. And this is a fluidic device called fluidic twister in our example. And on the left, what we see is the final design. If you're able to zoom in a lot, you will see it actually constitutes lots and lots of very small small voxels, and each of them is actually visualized as a small disk because they are boundaries, so they have to be a small, highly eccentric ellipsoid, which is a flat, large circle along the tangent direction, but with zero thickness along the normal direction. And the performance metric here, or the design intent here, is to let the flow pass through the back inlet and goes out from the front outlet. And we want the flow to be twisted, meaning we want the curl, we want it to generate non-zero curl. And what has surprised us is that we see there is a structure that looks like a propeller. If you are able to follow my mouse cursor, there is something that looks like a 4-blade propeller emerging out of the interior design space from scratch without any human prior knowledge. So this shows that the computational method actually has the potential to, in this case, possibly rediscover what a mechanical structure that matches our intuition if we want the flow to be twisted. But if we were to give more credits to the computational algorithms, we could hopefully say that this also shows the potential for the algorithm to outperform human designs in the future, because humans might need to come up with this design with domain expertise or prior knowledge, while a computational algorithm only need to do computation and without too much human intervention. Okay, so I have explained some tricky part and also some subtleties in modeling the modeling problem in solid fluid coupling. And next, let me move on to simulating such a system and share our findings using this paper published last year with our robotics colleagues. So in this work, our goal is to come up with a plausible and hopefully a fast simulator for our robotics friends to design soft underwater fish. And it turns out to be quite non-trivial due to a number of challenges. The first challenge is obviously that we will have to deal with fluidic mechanics, fluidic dynamics. And similarly, just like any other solid fluid coupling problems, we also need to deal with solid dynamics. But in this case, since our problem is to simulate a soft robot, soft fish, so the solid dynamics is also slightly more sophisticated. It has to be a deformable solid. And the third possible challenge is, of course, you will have to do coupling between solid and fluid areas along the interface. And finally, there's one more challenge introduced by the fact that this is a robot. On top of all the technical difficulties we mentioned before, it is that the soft fish has its own actuation, either through muscle fibers or tendons, or through pneumatic or hydraulic actuators, or any other basically mechanisms that let it move or let it change its behavior. So we are actually able to simulate this complicated scene using something like a commercial physics simulator, but it will be too slow for our robotics researchers to do a fast design iteration. Therefore, we proposed in this work an alternative solution which combines some machine learning ideas with some physics inspired ideas and obtain a hybrid simulator that achieves hopefully still plausible results, but at much less time cost. So let's first take a look at this result video. So here we have a two-dimensional fish, black fish, something that is basically wiggling its tail. And it is immersed in water indicated by the gray area. And the red arrows here along the interface indicate this is a computed force from the fluid imposed on the surface of the black fish, computed from its pressure and velocity. So hopefully this looks consistent to, or basically it matches our intuition of what a fish will experience if it is immersed in water. And there are some quantitative analysis on top of this, which I will turn to shortly after. So the basic idea behind this result is summarized in this very compact overview figure. The picture looks complicated, but the idea is actually easier to explain in verbally. Basically, there are three things that we need to simulate: the fluidic dynamics, the solid dynamics, and their coupling. And for the three things here, we basically address them differently. For the deformable solid dynamics, we respect the physical laws and simply implement a standard FEM solver with Newton's method, the standard solution that you can easily find in any commercial physics-based simulator. And for the fluidic dynamics, we introduced a neural network called the HydroNet, which takes as input the boundary information, velocity information, and outputs the pressure field and the velocity field of the fluids. And finally, to couple their effects together, we inherit the from the immersed boundary method and let the fluid and the solid region talk to each other through the interface of the lattice grid. So the whole pipeline here is not what I really want to focus on, but instead I would like to tell a little bit more about the motivation behind the design decisions. So why we ended up choosing these three combinations in this particular way. So the reason is that our robotics colleagues believes that for deform for solid simulation, the behavior or the material behavior of the deformable solid is more like it's easier to predict and easier to measure. Like all you need to do is measure its Young's modulus and the Poisson's ratio, which is not trivial, but still doable. And on the other hand, fluidic region is much more difficult to tackle. As Professor Yue mentioned just now, it's hard to measure water. Not only because fluid areas are fluidic dynamics, they're sensitive to boundary conditions, they're chaotic, but also their hyperparameters like viscosity are very difficult to measure. So therefore, hopefully you can share our reasons behind the design decisions. So this basically motivates us to choose to respect the physical laws when we simulate solid, but thinking about introducing a neural network to simulate fluid, and combining them together is merely following the basic idea of immersed boundary method. And a question that we got asked often is that now that you have this hybrid simulator, how accurate or how reliable your outcome would be if we were to compare this with a standard physics-based simulator. So here we presented a very preliminary validation experiment by comparing the result with our result with COMSOL, a commercial physics-based simulator. So this experiment was conducted on the same soft black 2D black fish showing a few slides earlier. So the horizontal axis here indicates the control frequency of the signals we send to the muscles or the actuators inside the black fish. It varies between 2 Hz to 6 Hz. And the vertical axis represents the horizontal offset of the black fish, the center of mass of the black fish after 120 frames. So I need to point out that the vertical axis begins with 100 unit instead of 0 unit. So the margin between the two systems, our HydroNet results, the blue curve, and the COMSOL results, the orange curve, the margin between them is actually less than you might think at the first glance. This is like about 5% relative errors between them. And what is slightly more exciting to us is that although we have 1 million reasons to believe our hybrid simulator will not be as precise as COMSOL, we are happy to see it still establishes the trends of the position with respect to the control frequency in a qualitatively correct fashion. As you can see, it grows, it increases between 2 to 5 Hz, meaning that within this range, if we increase the control frequency, the fish will swim faster. And this is also predicted by COMSOL. And after 5 Hz turns out to be a peak for some reason in this particular setup. And both COMSOL and our simulator correctly predicts this peak. So this turns out to be sufficiently good enough for robotics researchers to conduct further investigations on computational design, which is I will demonstrate with a real world extension. So this is the cute real world counterpart that our colleague built in their lab. This is a 2.5D soft fish of the 2-dimensional counterpart showing in simulation. extruded along the third direction, and it is actually embedded in water. So there's water. It's just too transparent to see, so that they have to inject some ink to basically visualize the motion. And in this work, they actually leveraged the HydroNet simulator to do some very classical robotic tasks like doing, I believe they did system identification to build a virtual model for this fish, and they also try to optimize the control frequency, basically how frequently you swing the tails of the softer fish, and so that you can maximize the thrust by interacting with water. So there is some legitimate applications of this hybrid simulator after we basically leverage the machine learning techniques, and it is faster, although possibly with sacrifices some precision. And lastly, I would like to spend a little bit of the time to talk about optimization. And once we have established a design representation, and once we have the simulation platform to evaluate the performance of physical systems with solid fluid coupling, the crux of the computational design pipeline is that we'll have to come up with an automatic way to fine-tune the design, or basically to improve the design so that it can achieve extremal performance. So this is covered by optimization. And I would like to use this recent work to illustrate this idea better. So this work is about exploring possible designs of aerial robot with propellers and fuselage and rods, all sorts of possible combinations, as long as the physics is applicable. And just like before, I am not going to cover all the technical details, but instead I'm going to focus on the major technical difficulty and explain the intuition behind our solution. So one of the biggest challenges here in designing such an aerial robot, or actually in designing rigid robots in general, is that it is a mixture of both continuous and discrete parameters. For example, in these flying vehicles, we have continuous parameters like the hyperparameters in the PID controller and the length of the rods, which continuously vary the performance and shape of the design. On the other hand, we also have some discrete parameters, like if you see the three figures on the right, they represent three designs with different numbers of rotors. And the number of rotors, as well as the propellers, these are discrete parameters that cannot be continuously varied, but they are, of course, a very crucial parameter that greatly affects the performance of the robot. So how would we come up with an efficient and effective way of figuring out what are the possible or the best possible discrete parameters leading to an extremal design? So the intuition behind this work is that we leverage the similarity between grammar in programming language or programming synthesis community with the procedure of a mechanical engineer assembling a concrete design. So taking this quad rotor at the bottom here as an example, if we were asked to assemble this design, we typically start with, for example, possibly nothing on the canvas, and then we pick the fuselage, the body of the design, and then we insert 4 rods and the joints and the propellers, motors, until we have a complete design. And it turns out that this procedure or the historical information can be concisely encoded by a grammar, a carefully designed grammar with some meticulously chosen rules. So let's walk through this procedure more closely. So at the very beginning, we have a start symbol S, representing basically an empty canvas. So nothing is there yet. And the very first rule in this grammar R1 indicates that you are allowed to replace the node S with a node body. So that corresponds to the process where a mechanical engineer picks the fuselage and puts that in place of the canvas. And then we see that we choose to apply the third rule, R3, 4 times. So let's take a look at what R3 encodes. So this turns out to be a rule that proposes to replace the body node with an extension to C. A C node here indicates a rotor joint. So this makes great sense to us. And applying this rule 4 times allows us to basically insert 4 rotor joints, corresponds to the 4 rods to be plugged in later. So this procedure goes on and on, allowing us to create a sequence of rules applied to the design, to the design, starting from scratch and eventually ending with a complete design. Now we not only have a flyable design in the end, we also have the historical information, and we encoded the process in a linear sequence of rules, and we also obtained the partial designs by realizing these rules or by executing these rules from scratch. So with that in mind, the next technical difficulty becomes how we're going to search for the optimal topology. So in this particular setup, we have now encoded every single topology with a sequence of rules, starting from a shared root, the start symbol in the grammar. So imagine if I were to be an oracle, and if I were to be able to basically see enumerate all the possible rules starting from start symbol, I should be able to obtain this gigantic tree structure where they have the shared root, and every end node or every leaf implies a complete design. And the path from the start symbol to the leaf will encode one sequence of the commands or the rules we were to execute in order to obtain a complete design. So now the problem becomes, how am I going to figure the best possible leaf hidden somewhere inside 1 million possibilities? And I would like to, and how would I figure this out in a very strategical and effective way? So this can be cast as a decision-making problem at every single step when we are traverse from the start symbol till the very end. So the idea we are using here is borrowed from RoboGramma, another paper written by my former colleague at MIT. So in short, this is essentially a you can interpret this as a deep Q learning approach imposed on this gigantic grammar tree, roughly speaking. So I'm going to sketch the basic idea behind this RoboGramma thing, and I will leave the technical details in the paper. You're welcome to check this out if you are interested in it. So the basic idea is that we imagine we have a neural network that encodes a value function at every single intermediate node in this tree, and the value function if it were computed by an oracle, it will be basically taking the maximum possible score from all the child leaves. Of course, computing this accurately will require gigantic computational resources, which is probably impossible except for very small problems. But for now, let's pretend that we have this oracle value function. And then the decision-making problem will become trivial at every single time, at every stage. For example, at the very beginning, if I am provided with 3 possible choices of the rules, rule number 1, 2, and 3, I could evaluate the intermediate children, and the value function will tell me from this values 5.5, 4, and 6.5. So I know from the rightmost subtree, there is something good hidden somewhere. deep down into its leaves. I know it has a maximum possible value. I just don't know where it is yet. But this already motivates me to take the rightmost branch. And moving on to the second layer. And similarly, if we still have this oracle function, we can recursively apply this procedure, guiding us to execute the rules on the fly and eventually assemble the proper designs in the end. So of course, I omitted a lot of technical details, like how would I train this value function, and what about the other continuous parameters. But this is basically the core idea and the tip of the iceberg. So let me end this section with one of the several results demonstrated in this paper to show you how this search rules can how this search algorithm can actually discover something interesting. So here we are demonstrating a turning task for a flying vehicle, where the green curve indicates a trajectory that requires the center of mass of a flying vehicle to fall off, and this implies that it has to make a left turn somewhere in the near future. And we have a loss function, which basically flips the reward in the previous search procedure. So lower loss means higher reward means better. And the two videos here will demonstrate two designs, the left one being the initial design and the right one being something that is discovered by the search algorithm. So what we found interesting in this task is that the right designs turns out to be something asymmetric. If you look at the mouse cursor, there is an asymmetric rotor, so which makes this a task-specific design, outperforming standard designs. But of course, you can imagine it suffers from if we switch to a different task, it might be inferior to the design to the regular design on the left. So this also opens up some future possibilities, like discovering designs that is optimal in some sense to multi-objectives, which we leave as in future discussion. Finally, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about some interesting future directions that we have been thinking about. And in particular, I would like to share some of our thoughts on combining physics with learning in solving computational design problems. And so this has been a recurrent pattern in the last two papers. And I'm going to take the view of the life cycle of a standard physics simulator. So it typically begins with establishing the physical model of the dynamical system, which is typically characterized by differential equations motivated by physical laws. So this is a continuous representation. And the next stage is to establish the numerical model by discretizing the physical model temporally and spatially, converting the problem into something a computer can understand and solve. And the last stage is that once you have the numerical problem, we will implement, we will apply some numerical solvers and doing time integration, solving linear or nonlinear systems, and studying the ideal CPU, GPU architecture, et cetera. So these are happening on the computational side. And it's perhaps not surprising to many of us that in recent years, there have been some interest in both the graphics and the machine learning communities to introduce learning techniques into every single stages in this overview pipeline. So I'm going to use two works recently accepted to ICML by my collaboration with our colleagues to illustrate this idea. So in this work, we proposed to train a neural network to replace the physical model and keeping everything else like the discretization schemes, the numerical model, and the computational model intact. So this shows the picture here shows the generalizability of our approach. As you can see, we were able to handle fluids and deformable solids, and by reconstructing the basically by learning from the input video, we'll be able to reconstruct the motion faithfully, but without prior knowledge on the material model. It was actually encoded by a hidden neural network. And I'm going to skip the topic of learning discretization or learning numerical model, but this is indeed also an interesting topic that we start to see some representative works. And I'm going to end the talk by mentioning another recently accepted work on learning computational model, or more concretely by learning to solve linear systems, but by combining classical numerical solvers with neural networks. And the picture here shows our demonstrations in some classic linear second order PDE problems. But the core idea here is much more interesting. And I would like to spend a little bit more time on explaining that. Basically, solving linear systems of equations is a very essential building block in PDE problems, solving PDEs numerically. And there are two types of solvers that we have seen so far from the classical numerical analysis and applied math community. We have reliable and robust solvers, but they are typically not fast enough for, especially for large-scale problems. On the other hand, there also has been a surge of neural network linear solvers from the machine learning community. They benefit from fast inference time, so the solver can be made very fast. But on the other hand, they are neural networks, so there is less guarantee on its accuracy and robustness. So in this work, we try to combine the best from both worlds and try to provide a hybrid solution that is hopefully both fast enough for some interesting applications, but without sacrificing the accuracy. So for more details, I believe we will be releasing more technical details and hopefully the source code shortly after this, and that will be the end of my talk. And I thank again for having this opportunity to share my recent works on computational design, and also having the opportunity to talk about some future directions. And I'm happy to take questions from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Du. And do we have any questions from the network? I will first ask one question about your future works. So do you think the large models of the deep network will help for the learning of computational fluid simulations?
This is a great question, and I have to admit I am in no way an expert of large models. This is really, really beyond my domain expertise. So I am not very confident that I could comment on this. But in general, I think there is something interesting ahead of us in the realm of combining learning and physics, especially in the context of fluid dynamics, because fluids have intricate dynamics. And neural networks can be something useful because they are pretty good at learning some or basically regressing to some data. And as I think one concrete example that we encountered is in the second work I mentioned, where my colleagues would like to do the soft underwater fish, where they actually proposed to do measurement of the fluidic environment, but this turned out to be not trivial at all. So that is one of the motivation why they turned to a neural network. And it turned out to be hopefully not a bad idea.
The reason why I asked this question is that recently, Huawei, the company Huawei, they present a large model that predicts worldwide weather. and they claim that the precision of their model is better than the traditional methods. So, well, do you think that it will have some difference when the model size is large enough in precision, with respect to precision?
I am not sure. As I said, I'm not an expert in large model, but I'm happy to, maybe I could provide one possible way of interpreting this. So the one way that we sometimes we think about the neural network versus physics in the following way. So in some sense, if people propose to replace a physical model with a neural network, if we are confident with the physical laws, like if we have full trust with Newton, then we could claim physical laws have infinite generalizability. They should be applicable to almost all the physical phenomena that you might encounter in your life. And on the other hand, the neural network is a learned model. And for a learned model, you need to talk about the training data set, the test set generalizability. And in some sense, you might think of this as you are trading the generalizability with something that is more frequent in the training set. So it's just like Navier-Stokes equation always works. It's if we believe this is the actual model for fluids, but the hardware setup may just be a small subset of all possible fluidic behaviors that we might encounter. So in this case, a neural network might be learning something specifically focused on this small subsets, but sacrificing the generalizability to some rarely seen phenomena. Maybe you might not be able to encounter in your lifetime. So this is just sometimes I would like to contemplate this idea, but again, I am in no way an expert in large model, or I should be humble enough to say that I'm also not an expert in machine learning. So just my 2 cents. Hopefully that I can contribute. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question about your first work introduced. So your first work introduced a method to optimize the solid shapes to conduct a fluid flow. My question is, what about if I have a rolling fan in your tunnel, when the boundary is moving, will your method also work, or there should be something added to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The current version of this work handles static boundary only. So the rigid body are essentially static. The water can of course flow and has velocity, but the rigid boundary is static. And a rolling fan inside the design is of course something that we would like to explore more, but that would require something slightly different in terms of the modeling process, because the rigid your boundary is no longer static. So we need to come up with a way of handling this rolling pattern. Okay, thank you. It's time for the end, and so let's thank the 2 speakers again, and thank you for coming to this tonight's seminar. And here ends our seminar. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions.